1991, the Soviet Union, one of the most powerful nations on Earth, collapsed. Born in socialist revolution almost 3/4 of a century earlier, its birth in 1917 sent shockwaves around the world.
Everything that happened in the 20th century happened really because of the Russian Revolution. The idea of revolution itself, the whole experiment in socialism, indeed the counterface of that, Nazism and fascism as a counter-revolution against Bolshevism. So the Second World War. So the Cold War that follows from the division that results directly from 1917.
Right from the start, the Russian Revolution promised a better world of equality, dignity, and social justice. What happened to those promises? As the 20th century began, the Romanov dynasty had ruled the sprawling Russian Empire, 1/6 of the world's landmass, with an iron grip for almost 300 years. They had only recently freed Russia's millions of peasants from slavery.
Russia was definitely the most repressive major state in Europe at the turn of the century. It had no legal rights. It didn't even have an established rule of law. There was no free expression. There was censorship.
There was no real participation of the vast masses of the population in the governing of the country. And the great wealth of the country went to the top.
While a tiny minority lived in splendor, the vast majority were barefoot peasants surrounded by mud and squalor. In 1900, 50% of the empire's children died before age 5. Russia's small middle class was in better health, but starving for political freedom. A government official bragged, "There is no citizen who can rest assured that his home won't be searched and he himself won't be arrested."
There was huge discontent with this repressive system, but there was no mechanism for most of these individuals to try to change the system from within. The only way they could see to change the system was from out, and this meant by revolutionary change.
But how and when the revolution would start was anyone's guess. By 1917, Imperial Russia had been fighting and losing the First World War for nearly 3 years. Millions of soldiers were dead, with even more wounded. Food shortages at the front and back home were catastrophic. Then, on February 23rd, International Women's Day, a group of women factory workers in the capital, Petrograd, set out on a march demanding bread.
They went to nearby factories and they pound on the doors, and sort of factory after factory comes out, and it just snowballs, and then it continues the next day and more until by the 25th, 2 days later, virtually the entire industrial working force, the universities, students, much of just the population in general are on the streets demonstrating against the regime.
On the third day, Tsar Nicholas II ordered his army to fire on the demonstrators. Raw recruits, young sons of peasants and workers, looked down the barrels of their guns at women who resembled their mothers. It wasn't the first time the Tsar had issued such an order. 12 years earlier, 150,000 factory workers and their children tried to present a petition to Nicholas, begging for better working conditions. Troops blocked their path, opened fire, and mowed them down, killing 40 and wounding hundreds. The date, January 9th, 1905, became known as Bloody Sunday.
This is a crucial moment, really, in Russian history, because the whole idea of the good Tsar, the benevolent patriarchal Tsar, was exploded in that moment. The Tsarist forces here were firing on innocent people. And this acted as a catalyst to political demonstrations throughout the country.
Worker and peasant strike committees sprang up from the Ukraine to Siberia. They called themselves Soviets, meaning council in Russian. By the fall of 1905, a general strike had brought the country to a standstill. Tsar Nicholas, a weak ruler who hated the idea of sharing power, offered a half-hearted reform, a parliament of noblemen called the Duma. But then he struck back hard at the strikers, executing and exiling tens of thousands. Resentment simmered under the surface until 1914, when the regime came up against a force it could not beat into submission: World War I. At first, Russians patriotically rallied around their Tsar. The breaking point came that February morning in 1917, when Tsarist troops faced off against the women demanding bread on the streets of Petrograd. It looked like 1905 all over again, but this time, something snapped. Most soldiers refused to fire, and then some took aim and shot their officers.
So they've now mutinied and killed their officers in wartime. They've burnt their bridges. And by the middle of the morning, the government has lost control of armed force in the capital. And that then is what really turns the demonstrations into revolution. Then the crowds now control the street and they're armed.
For the next 10 months, from February until October, Russian workers, peasants, and soldiers, who'd been perhaps the most downtrodden people in Europe, would be the freest on earth. On March 2nd, only a week after the women first filled the streets, the Tsar's generals convinced him to give up his throne. It meant the end of the Romanov dynasty, but they hoped to contain the revolution.
In doing that, they'd unleashed it. And the revolution they unleashed was the revolution of their nightmares.
It's not one revolution. There are thousands of revolutions going on. In every village, there's its own revolution. The revolution in the armed forces is a different revolution. There's a political revolution. There's a religious revolution. There's a revolution in domestic environments as servants overturn their masters. So this is something that is much too big for any leader to control.
A succession of leaders would struggle to do just that for the rest of the year. First to try were the same upper-class men who'd filled the Tsar's old parliament. They reinvented themselves as the new provisional government, ended censorship and the death penalty, and even granted women the right to vote. At the same time, people on the streets, determined to direct their own destinies, remembered the Soviets they'd formed in 1905 and organized new ones. Word spread quickly, and within days there were Soviets across the vast empire.
This sudden appearance of Soviets everywhere is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the 1917 revolution and an indication of the strength of grassroots democracy in Russia.
The difference is, the radical difference is, whereas in 1905 it had come just as the revolutionary upheaval was collapsing, in 1917 they're formed at the very beginning.
Soldiers' wives, teenaged factory workers, sailors, and waiters were only a few of the groups that formed Soviets, began to organize, and demanded their rights.
What these groups overwhelmingly wanted was a democratic Russia, whatever that meant, because they didn't have a lot of experience with democracy, and a socialist Russia, whatever that meant.
For many, socialism meant sharing the wealth, the power, and the decision-making. Soldiers from the Petrograd Soviet took the first step toward completely remaking society with a document they named Order Number 1. It called for setting up soldier committees to make decisions alongside officers, and it demanded that officers, for the first time, treat foot soldiers with dignity.
It's one of the most important documents to come out of the revolution. It just totally changes the command system of the Russian army, and it marks the transfer of soldier loyalty to the Soviet, so that the soldiers of the garrison in Petrograd, and then soon everywhere, is going to be first to the Soviet and only secondly to the government. And that was what will make the Soviet the more powerful institution.
The Soviet was not at that stage challenging the provisional government for power, for national authority. It was acting not as an alternative government in waiting, but as a massive pressure group. They were what we are very accustomed to in a modern democracy, a powerful lobby.
The upper-class provisional government and the working-class Soviet agreed on an informal power-sharing arrangement. They even shared a building, the Tauride Palace. The government occupied one wing and the Soviet the other. Each group believed it could not succeed alone. Both were committed to creating a revolutionary new society. But they had to figure out how.
From the beginning of the revolution, it was understood that Russia needed a new constitution, a new political order. Tsarism was gone, and Russia was going to be some kind of republic, democracy perhaps. And so there was going to be a Congress, what we would call a constitutional Congress, but which they called in Russia a constituent assembly.
Plans began for a nationwide election of representatives to the Constituent Assembly. But elections need political parties. The parties, illegal under the Tsar, sprang up alongside the Soviets with overlapping memberships, but separate organizations. By early 1917, there was a party for the upper classes and 3 socialist parties for the poor. The Socialist Revolutionaries for peasants, the Mensheviks for most workers, and for extreme radicals, the weakest and smallest party, the Bolsheviks. They all began preparing for the Constituent Assembly elections, but set no firm date amid the chaos and excitement.
Well, after the overthrow of the monarchy, there was a sort of an era of good feeling in Petrograd, a sense that this long-held hope has suddenly happened. The monarchy is overthrown. We're on the way to creating the new glorious future. And sort of all political parties and all political tendencies, including the Bolsheviks, had come together to make things come out right.
But an obscure revolutionary leader would soon shatter that feeling. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, founder and head of the Bolshevik Party. He wasn't in Russia when the revolution began. He'd been in exile for over a decade, and few Russians even knew who he was. A driven man with a formidable intellect, Lenin had dedicated his life to world revolution on behalf of oppressed workers. He arrived in Petrograd on April 3rd, rolled up his sleeves, and went on the attack.
Until that moment, the Bolshevik Party had gone along with all the other parties in the Soviet in arguing that you don't want Soviet power now. You don't want to give power to these local committees springing up everywhere because they're not organized. Lenin comes back and immediately says, no, give power to the Soviets. It is time to end the war. It is time to give bread, peace, and land to the people. And the only way we can do this effectively is to give power to the Soviets.
What he's working his way toward is a new definition of democracy. For the others, including the other socialists, democracy meant democracy as we think of it, is equal rights for everybody. Lenin is working his way toward a redefinition of that as power for the lower classes.
You give power to the peasants in the villages, which means you exclude the nobility and the rural intelligentsia. You give power to the workers in the factory, which means you exclude the factory owners and the engineers who work there. This idea of class power contradicted a more general sense of democratic government, where everyone would be represented through a parliament.
So he's beginning to create the idea that we can create a whole new form of government based on the Soviets that is clearly, well, the term will come to be used, a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Lenin's ideas shocked everyone, even his own Bolsheviks. But the horrors and privations of World War I and missteps by the fragile provisional government would soon make Lenin's message appeal to many soldiers and workers.
The provisional government was an ally of Britain and France in the war against Germany, and the provisional government believed that Russia should benefit from this war. It should get various kinds of compensation after the war, reparations of some kind.
But the soldiers increasingly refused to fight for some distant political advantage, even if their revolutionary government ordered them to.
1 out of every 3 soldiers in the Russian army in World War I was a casualty. So, you can look here, look there. One of you three is going to be either seriously wounded or dead. The soldiers don't want to go to the front. Soldiers who are at the front want the war to end.
By May, Russia's military was collapsing, and with it, perhaps, the revolution. As an invasion loomed, political leaders representing workers and peasants in both the Soviets and the two main socialist parties agreed to do what they'd earlier refused. They officially joined with the upper-class politicians to form a coalition government. While the Bolsheviks jeered from the sidelines, these leaders did what they thought was necessary to save the revolution.
But it was really a crucial mistake, because already by June 1917, people really wanted an end to the war, especially the soldiers on the front. So in a sense, by joining the Liberals in government, both those parties lost a lot of popularity by hitching their fortunes to a war that was going from bad to worse.
With the socialist leaders officially part of the government, workers and peasants began to blame them for the government's failings.
Workers see their economic conditions deteriorating. They see the shortage of foodstuffs. They see factory closures and layoffs, and they want action.
Soldier and worker anger exploded on July 3rd. Suddenly, tens of thousands of armed demonstrators were filling the streets of Petrograd and shouting, "All power to the Soviets."
Once the demonstrations start, one of the places they go is to Bolshevik headquarters, because the Bolsheviks have been calling for all power to the Soviets. And so they go to the Bolsheviks naturally expecting leadership. And the Bolshevik party leadership was caught by surprise. Lenin was actually vacationing in Finland. He was resting, he'd gone out for a rest.
Lenin didn't want to get involved with a movement that wasn't close to his ideas and under his control from the beginning. His idea of revolution was that it should be something which would be organized and disciplined and led by a revolutionary vanguard, not a spontaneous uprising from below.
Rushing back to Petrograd, Lenin surprised the demonstrators by urging restraint. Confused but still angry, they headed to the Tauride Palace, the shared home of the provisional government and the Soviet.
And there's a famous episode in which the soldiers surrounded an open car which held some of the Soviet leaders, and the soldiers said, "Take power, you sons of bitches, when it's given to you."
And the Soviet was afraid to take power. They were still in coalition with the provisional government.
Violence broke out, and some 400 people were killed before lack of leadership and a sudden rainstorm finally broke up the demonstration after the third day. The spontaneous revolution from below had failed. In desperation, the government reshuffled itself and chose Alexander Kerensky, a moderate socialist, as its new prime minister.
There were alternatives to the right, significantly to the right, namely a military dictator, and there were alternatives to the extreme left. But in the middle, there were no other leaders who could sort of rally everybody's acceptance. It's just sort of that he's the man who divides us least.
Kerensky immediately blamed the Bolsheviks for the demonstrations. He arrested several leaders, though Lenin escaped to neighboring Finland. It looked like the Bolsheviks were finished, but within 2 months, the provisional government would be hanging on by a thread. Kerensky, hugely popular at first, kept putting off the Constituent Assembly election, which would form a permanent government. His inaction and a steady stream of bad news from the trenches drove workers and soldiers into the waiting arms of the Bolsheviks.
At the bottom of society, a radicalization is taking place as the war becomes worse and worse for Russia. At the same time, at the top of society, you have the moderate classes, the middle classes and the nobles and so forth, becoming more and more upset by this radicalization, and they become more conservative. So what you get is a pulling apart of society, a polarization, a real class struggle, the bottom against the top.
It was everything Lenin could have hoped for. Between summer and fall, Soviets big and small throughout Russia installed Bolsheviks as their leaders. Leon Trotsky, Lenin's brilliant right-hand man, was elected head of the Petrograd Soviet, the most powerful in the country. His fiery speeches drew in even more members.
What made the Bolsheviks' message most appealing and the Bolsheviks politically most successful was their democracy. They're willing to entertain different points of view and to open the party quite widely, which was not true before 1917. It would not be true after 1917. But their message, and this was Lenin told them to hammer on from April onwards, was peace. They were a party that was against the war. They were the party for land, implying land to the peasants. And they were the party for bread.
But to Lenin, peace, land, and bread were springboards for a much more ambitious vision.
Lenin is beginning to look towards Soviet power, not as a means of simply meeting the demands of the masses, but of establishing a power base for what he expects, which is the complete universal world revolution starting in Russia, which is going to break down capitalism, establish socialism, anywhere capitalism existed. So these two revolutions come together. A mass revolution for democracy, self-representation, and better conditions for workers and peasants, roughly, and this utopian expectation of transforming the whole of society and the whole of human nature.
By September, 7 months after the revolution began, Soviets across the country believed it was time for them to run the government themselves, without the middle and upper classes. They called for a National Congress of Soviets to meet in Petrograd in October to talk about a peaceful transfer of power. Lenin had other plans. He'd refused to take power in July. 2 months later, he was ready to use force to get it.
The arguments Lenin used had a certain logic to them, which is that there's a vacuum of power developing. The institutions of representative government that we're trying to establish here don't really hold water. There is a danger of a military dictatorship developing, in which case we are already in a situation of civil war. And if that is the case, then why not take power in our own hands now by violence if necessary? Because once we have power and have established the dictatorship of the proletariat, as the ideology goes, we can then build socialism. That is his logic.
I mean, everybody was talking about it. It was in the newspapers, on the street corners. Everybody was talking about, will the Soviet take power? What are the Bolsheviks going to do? I mean, there was a general expectation that when the Congress met, the radicals who had been calling for the Soviet to take power would do that.
On October 24th, the day before the Congress of Soviets was scheduled to meet, Prime Minister Kerensky, worried about an attack on his government, ordered Bolshevik Party newspapers shut down. Loyal troops smashed printing presses and sealed the doors.
It sends the printers running to the Petrograd Soviet and saying, what's happened? And the Soviet leaders who are there says, counter-revolution. Kerensky is striking. He's going to try to prevent the Congress of Soviets from meeting, and they call on their supporters, soldiers and workers, to come out and guarantee that this Congress of Soviets will meet. And that starts off the armed confrontation that leads to the October Revolution. Not Lenin. It wasn't something the Bolsheviks decided to do. It happens in response to Kerensky.
Armed soldiers, sailors, and workers, all members of the Petrograd Soviet and mostly Bolsheviks, met little resistance as they took over bridges, railway stations, and telephone and telegraph offices throughout the capital city. Their final target was the Winter Palace, once official residence of the Tsar and then Kerensky, who had already fled.
In Soviet myth, the October Revolution became a great mass revolution. And the idea was then perpetrated through Eisenstein's film, which is often mistaken for real clippage, of the people storming the Winter Palace. In fact, there were probably No more than 100 or so Red Guards involved in the actual storming of the Winter Palace. But, you know, they didn't have to storm the palace. The palace was virtually empty and open. They just had to walk into the palace to take power.
Across town at the Congress of Soviets, the Bolsheviks, led by Trotsky, announced they had seized power in the name of the Soviets.
And when the announcement was made, representatives of the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries stormed out of the Congress in protest. At which point Trotsky said to the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries, "Go, walk out and into the dustbin of history."
Well, once they walk out, the Bolsheviks now have a majority, so they can now proceed to create an all-Bolshevik government under Lenin's leadership. There's no way Lenin could have predicted that or planned for it. Everybody expected the Congress of Soviets to create a multi-party socialist government. Lenin simply got an unexpected lucky break that allowed him to turn a revolution in the name of the Soviets into a kind of a Bolshevik revolution.
Despite pitched battles in Moscow, most of the country went along with the Bolsheviks at first, waiting to see what they'd do. Many expected a Bolshevik-run government to fail, including quite a few Bolsheviks. But after 8 months of one weak-willed head of state after another, this time someone held the reins of government who would not let go.
Lenin was not the sort of leader who was going to win power through the ballot box. But his great strengths in the party, and potentially in the country at large, were, I think, firstly, his iron logic. The idea that if you want socialism and you can take power to get it, do so now, which made sense to the rank and file in the party. And also, I think, his ruthlessness, his military organizational skills were unparalleled.
Lenin's Bolsheviks had promised to hold the long-awaited Constituent Assembly election, and they did. It would be the first and last free election in Russia for over 70 years. The Bolsheviks won in Petrograd, Moscow, and other big cities, but to their surprise, they came in a distant second overall to the Peasant Party, the Socialist Revolutionaries.
Lenin now turns to the question, well, what do we do about this? Because Lenin was not willing to relinquish power.
So Lenin allowed the Constituent Assembly to come to Petrograd to have its meeting for one day. But when the Constituent Assembly, led by these socialist revolutionaries, refused to recognize Lenin's government, Lenin and his allies closed the Constituent Assembly and it never met again. And when people resisted that closing, the Soviet government actually put down a rebellion and shot into the crowds to stop any resistance to its Soviet power.
The seizure of power in the name of the Soviets, all power to the Soviets, was day one of the decline of the power of the Soviets. From the very day that Lenin came to power, Soviets began to have less and less role to play.
The January 1905 attack by Tsarist troops on innocent civilians had given birth to a revolutionary dream of a better world. The January 1918 attack by Bolshevik troops on innocent civilians marked the beginning of that dream's end.
I think the decision to disperse the Constituent Assembly had repercussions of greatest magnitude for the rest of Russian history. Because by this action, Lenin really breaks with the revolution as it had happened at that point. It pushes the Bolsheviks down the road of authoritarianism and dictatorship. Lenin now says, we will not accept being voted out of office. Well, if you can't be voted out of office, then there's nothing for your opponents to do except either give up altogether or take to arms to resist you. So it makes civil war inevitable.
It would take over 3 years for the Bolshevik Red Army to defeat a right-wing White Army, trying to restore the Tsar and upper-class privilege. the brutality on both sides was staggering.
I don't think anyone, even within the Bolshevik Party, involving themselves in the seizure of power in October 1917, could have expected that events would turn out the way that they did. With a very bloody civil war, which ended in famine, with millions of deaths, we still don't know how to count them.
In the midst of the horror, Lenin did give land to the peasants. He eliminated the gap between rich and poor and got Russia out of World War I. But he also introduced censorship, secret police, and state terror. These and other institutions he set up, at least as brutal as those of the Tsar he replaced, allowed Joseph Stalin to come to power after Lenin's death in 1924. One of the 20th century's great monsters, Stalin was responsible for some 20 million deaths of his own people and untold numbers of ruined lives.
There are many people who think that Stalinism was the natural, inevitable outgrowth of 1917. That revolution itself must contain within it terror, violence, dictatorship. But none of that was in the cards. None of that was necessarily so in 1917, when ordinary men and women went out into the streets to fight for freedom, for what they called democracy, and for what they called socialism. When you actually look at what they say, they talk about social justice, about dignity, about respect for people. So the revolution was made in a moment of idealism and enthusiasm. It's very hard to capture that again, that feeling that we're going to create a new order, that we're going to transform, in fact, human nature. But that was what the revolution was about.
The revolutionary government that no one expected to last would achieve great things during its over 70-year reign. But its brutality betrayed the hopes and dreams of the people who brought it to power. And ultimately, their children and grandchildren brought it down.